Some of my ideas are still, I think, being formed. I was actually just having a conversation with my brother this weekend about our aunt and preaching and being an elder. And I think I would say confidently that I don't think women should be elders. I think that's biblically a man's role. And I do think that preaching in like a congregational setting should be a man, because biblically, I think there's some evidence just for the role of women. It's not to, stand in front of a mixed group and be the sole preacher. That being said, I know a lot of women missionaries who will come and present and speak on their work. And I do think that is okay, because I think the intent of that is more to share information than to speak into spiritual formation in the same way. Not that that kind of thing doesn't spiritually form you, but I think the intent is different. And I think that women can certainly teach Bible studies and lead children's ministries. I've led Bible studies for young adults, and that's a mixed group, and I think that's okay. But I would say that I don't think women should preach or be elders, because I think biblically that's a man's job. Obviously, it's something I wrestle with because I'm super close with my aunt, and I think she's a really strong Christian, and I value her wisdom. So reconciling those two things is kind of an ongoing thing. I don't know that that's necessarily a salvation issue, but I haven't studied it. I mean, I'm from more conservative circles, I would say overall, and a fairly conservative Bible school. I've studied the Bible. What I read in the Bible, I take to be forming my decisions. And those verses, I think it's in Timothy, where he talks about the role of elders and deacons. And then the verses in Corinthians, where it talks about the role of women in the church. I just more mean that I haven't spent, weeks and weeks sitting over and reading commentaries and that kind of thing. When I read scripture, that's what I got out of it.
Potlucks, pulpits, and everything in between. Episode 3 is about stories. Episode 1 was framing the nature of this research topic about the participation of women in the evangelical church in Canada. Episode 2 took a look at where we are in history by reflecting on how we think of ourselves in comparison to the United States, to the United Kingdom, because in the 21st century, there are new topics that seem to be changing the conversation yet again. Lindsay, the thing that we ended off in episode 2 was the need for stories. There were things that came up in episode 2 that seemed a bit cathartic to both of us, particularly the way it influences the conversation today. What surprised you about episode 2 and the historic role of women in church life in Canada?
Well, maybe not surprising, but just helpful to hear Dr. Robertson talking about the integral role of women in Canadian church history affirmed. We've known it, that part of the history. I think sometimes people call it social history, where it's looking more on the ground of how things happen, what everyday life is. And so if you think about what you might be drawing on as source material, are you looking at official documents, or are you looking at, say, letters or diary entries? And so sometimes you get a different picture when you're getting a snapshot of what's happening on the ground versus sort of the official story or narrative that you might hear elsewhere. And so I just really appreciated Dr. Robertson pointing to the vital role of the establishment of evangelicalism in Canada. Thinking about how something like the vote for women was actually a conversation about the personhood of women, that strikes me as something that is just very Christian, that we promote and believe in the dignity of women and all people made in the image of God. And actually, there were some points while we were doing this research where I got emails from people going, this isn't about women's rights for us. It's much deeper. It's more foundational than that. It's much more theological, actually. It's about who women are and what God has created them to be. And women being made in the image of God means that there is an inherent dignity.
The idea of personhood as a reflection of creation, in Canada, we haven't distinguished between men and women. We are all persons. That seems to be a little different than potentially other countries where we're not recognized with the same rights as persons, where there's more of an identification of men versus women. Episode 3 is about stories. So in the previous episode, both Abby Day, particularly in her ethnography research, and Karen Swallow Pryor in her contemporary writing and her work, They both encouraged our need to reflect on women's stories in Canada. While we're similar culturally, our stories is important when we contend with the differences of our vast distances in space and land, our different kinds of mixes of denominations, our multiculturalism, and the way we have invited or not invited immigrants into the country.
And there's like a one-dimensionality to certain storytelling instruments. I'm thinking numbers, surveys, even just an infographic is going to try to distill things down to the simplest common denominator. And that tends to flatten the richness of what I think Doctors Day and Pryor are trying to pull out. Story is so compelling, it captures the imagination. It's actually what helps change the social imaginary, kind of restructuring what is normal and what is possible. And then it helps you imagine what could be possible for you or the next generation.
So the stories then are different than the statistics, than the numbers, than the calculations. So how do you think then the stories that you have been accumulating and the stories we've been listening to and the stories we will listen to, how are they going to benefit your research and help shape the report?
I always say the best part, the interviews are the best part of our research. And really what the survey does is it just helps us understand the prevalence of those experiences. And so we always start with understanding the stories because let me give you an example. On our survey, we asked, where are you currently serving in your church? And so people picked all the places that they're serving. If we had said, name all the ways that you are serving and have served in the church, they would have picked almost everything. And we wouldn't have been able to get a great snapshot of what's happening now, nor would we have been able to capture snapshots by age of how participation changes by age. So there's a value to what a survey can capture, but then we can understand more of the shape of the stories by having those interviews. And then we see, oh, a woman might serve in this area when she's single, but when she's married and have children, she serves in this way. When she's retired, she's serving in these ways. So there's just something about the shape and the contours of lived experience over time that a survey can't capture. Surveys will capture the surface level, like as much as can be answered with a one-word answer to a question. And so a researcher gets to say, what do you mean by that? Or could you tell me more by that? And then they have to think about why they said what they just said. And I think when we have the opportunity to dig deeper and to not just ask how many times do you do this? Where do you serve? But ask, how do you feel about that? What do you think about that? What led you to that? How did you come to that understanding? Once you get past the pleasantries and you really dig into the why and the how, there will be some really interesting information that comes up. And I'm not sure that in the context of churches, that level of depth is being accomplished when we say that we listen to women. So you have to kind of go beyond a 20-minute conversation to a 1-hour conversation. And we found this in the interviews. We asked near the beginning, tell me a bit about your church. And they would give this really rosy, beautiful picture. And they still love the church, but eventually during the course of the conversation, they would get to some pain points or they would get to some areas of improvement. You know, I wish we did this, or I feel like we've lost our sense of mission. And I just wonder if when we actually attend to women and ask them deep questions and pull out a response beyond the one that they think you want to hear, that we get to real love for the church and ideas for its growth and improvement. And there's this one older woman that we interviewed, and she said it took 60 years for her church to become the place that she wanted it to become. And she told her pastor, I've prayed for 60 years. And so there's this amazing patience and resilience because women love the church and they want to see it become what it can be. And they have wonderful perspective, but they also have amazing ideas for how to get there. And I think listening and then asking and digging are key ways to pull that information out.
And listening takes time.
It does take time. And change takes time.
You're not just going to extract great stories in the first 5 minutes of a conversation. Conversations require trust.
Exactly. They have to know that they're not going to be accused of being critical or
reactionary.
Reactionary, exactly.
As we listen to women's stories, through the research, you've identified a number of topics that have been consistent in the way women are telling stories. And they include their narratives of their faith, their own personal devotion, generational or cultural shifts, the way they participated in their giftings, the way they're navigating obstacles and barriers around participating in church, and whether women are disillusioned and leaving or they're finding reasons to stay in the church. But we run into some ethical issues around the creation of the research.
Yeah, when you do research with human subjects, you have to make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality and maintaining consent. And so when we conducted the interviews with the informants that we recruited, yes, they signed up, but also we need to protect, they have rights as human participants and subjects in research. So one of our dilemmas, I guess, as we were thinking about putting together these stories for a podcast was we did not get express consent from these women to share the audio, to share their actual voice. So while we can extract some portions and change some details, we have to be very careful in how we steward these stories. So you and I kind of went back and forth about possible ways that we could still share these important stories, but also protect the people behind them. And so one way was I conducted a few more interviews with the express intent that they would be used for the podcast so that we can kind of get a picture of what a research interview looks like, but then we also have the permission and the protections built into that conversation. And then we also did a few dramatic recreations of interviews. So they are from the interviews, but not in the women's voices. Some details are changed or at least obscured to protect the identities of the women, but we're still getting to hear some of the really great nuggets that helped inform our study.
And so then these are the people we refer to by name: Marty, Anne-Marie, Albie, and Nikki. So that said, here are some interesting stories that have come out of your research. The first topic is the narrative of faith. But before we get into specific experiences in church life, we have to start at the foundation, how women understand their faith in the first place. Because what we've heard in the research is that women aren't just passively receiving theology, they're actively interpreting scripture, forming convictions, and sometimes wrestling with what they've been taught. How is belief formed? How is scripture read? And what happens when personal convictions and lived experiences don't line up neatly? Interviewed by Lindsay, Anne-Marie's journey of faith started with her French Catholic upbringing in Ontario and led to her eventual career in evangelical student ministry in Quebec. Reflecting on her work in the church, she talks about her experience of gender dynamics within the Quebec church and the views about women that she encountered.
My first book as a child was a book of Bible stories. And I grew up with just this love and admiration for Jesus and deep envy. Deep envy for those who had actually been able to see him and follow him and listen to him. And so my experience in the Catholic Church was a very, very positive one. And so I just can't remember a time when I wasn't attracted to Jesus. And so when I heard the gospel at 16, it was like, are you kidding me? Anybody, not just the best people, not just the most pious or most holy, but anyone can know Jesus, like the great saints that I admired knew Jesus. And I said, who wouldn't want that relationship with him? The Catholic Church prepared me for conversion, okay? In the Catholic tradition, that should be occurring when you have your confirmation. I was expecting something spiritually amazing. And so I would say, yes, that I didn't see it as a conversion at the time. I saw it as the beginning of living out a faith in God that had become personal. Okay. So I would say I saw it kind of like a confirmation, but a true one.
Oh, amazing.
Later on, in an evangelical context, I adopted the language.
Okay.
And called it my conversion. My calling was to evangelize women and help women become solid in their faith. But I was also part of a team. Mm-hmm. We always worked in teams. And the team was like everybody had their say, and we made decisions as a team.
Right.
In prayer. It was never, this is the leader, you're subservient, and you just have to do what the leader says. It was always your team. Mm-hmm. Everyone has an equal voice. And so that was wonderful. The training wasn't different for the men or the women. We all went through the same training. We all had to do all the tasks, whether it was public speaking, organizing events, organizing evangelistic outreaches. And so there was just such a sense of working in unity, working in love, and really giving ourselves fully to the mission. Well, to God first and the mission. I worked with an organization, Power to Change, that really emphasizes trusting in the Spirit rather than yourself and really depending on Him moment by moment and everything. You know, one person asked me, what books do you use when you study the Bible? And I said, well, I use the Bible. I use the Greek. I use the Hebrew. And she said, no, I mean books. You can't just study the Bible on your own. And I went, what do you mean? And she says, you're a woman. You're easily deceived. Oh. You need to read a book written by a man who explains the Bible for you. And I was like shocked that this attitude was there and was being promoted by women and they weren't questioning it. And I said, can you show me anywhere in Scripture where it says women can study the Bible? And there was a very strong obligation environment in the church, not in all the churches, but in one particular church that I've been in the most, where, you know, it was like if you were a woman working outside the home, you were looked down on.
Okay.
Because you weren't being truly biblical. Okay. In their evaluation. And I remember one young woman saying, you know, we're not making enough money. My husband wants me to go work outside the home. What do you think about that? And I said, well, I have nothing to say about it. That's a decision for you and your husband to make. Nobody should be telling you what to do there. But people had been telling her what to do.
Oh, interesting.
And it was causing a problem with her husband. And I said, no, you're called to make the decision. You're called to live united. That's something you decide as a couple. And she just hugged me because I was the first woman to tell her, we got no business there, girl. Wow. and so that's when I realized that I had entered into a very different environment. Women would also tell me, you're not allowed to talk to men.
Just in general? In
general. And I said, what? Well, you could be a source of temptation. And I meant, why? I know. I said, so these attitudes were there, and it shocked me. I still hadn't heard words like complementarian, egalitarian. That was even later.
Okay.
But the whole idea that women were less, and women had to live by these rules that men didn't have to live by.
So they could speak to women, for example, but you couldn't speak to them?
Well, it was, no. Well, that one, you know, a lot of women weren't happy if their men spoke to women.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because they had been taught that women would tempt their men. And so it was like, all of a sudden, it's like the woman is the temptress. Women are tempters. Women are incapable. Women are easily deceived. I'd never heard this in my life, and it seemed very toxic to me. Because by then, you've got feminism. You've got women saying, we are people. We're not children. And we have the right to be adults. We have the right to vote. We should have the right to vote. We should have the right to be able to open a bank account without a man signing for us. We should have the right to choose professions according to our abilities. We should have the right to have the same rights as men. And I think some people in the church saw that as bad.
Okay.
I think they didn't recognize that was the gospel. That the gospel says we are all the same in Christ, that we all have the same privileges, that we all have the same spirit, that we all have the same calling, that we all have the same dignity, that we're all in his image, and we're all called to become more and more like Jesus and to serve him. Question of, can women exercise their gifts as freely as men? What about these 3 passages that I used? Really, there's only 3. And 2 of them don't count. So you're left with 1. And if you understand that one right, you're left with none. That's my opinion.
Oh, when you say don't count, though, could you tell me?
Okay, 1 Corinthians 11.
Okay.
1 Corinthians 11 is saying women have the right to pray and prophesy in mixed groups.
Okay, so you're not saying it doesn't matter. You're just saying it doesn't. It can't be used towards this point.
It has been used.
Okay.
It has been used, but it was just studying Scripture, having questions thrown at me by my daughters, all of that.
Oh, okay.
Because they weren't happy with the complementarian position that they were hearing from other people. They never heard it from my husband and I.
Okay.
But they were picking it up.
Sure.
From things other people were telling them.
Okay.
And they didn't understand how that fit the gospel.
Oh, interesting.
And so I said, okay, well, I'll study it. So I did for 7 years.
Wow.
Because, that's the way I am. I'm not going to just read one book. I'm going to go read as much as I can from as many sources as I can, from as many epics as I can. I read the Middle Ages. I read Calvin. I read Luther. All that informed. Like, I found that, we're being influenced by society when we say women can't do things.
Oh, interesting, because I think I've heard alternative arguments that would say we're capitulating to the culture.
Yeah, well, I think we're blind to how much culture has influenced interpretation and translation throughout church history.
Okay.
And a lot of the ideas that were popular about women and their inferiority and their impurity came not from the Bible, but from Aristotle.
Aristotle.
Yeah,
I read.
And we didn't realize how much Aristotle and even the Greco-Roman culture influenced our understanding of the Bible for a long time.
Right.
There were some changes that were coming in with the Reformation. And like I said, a lot of women were participating in mission work, both on the Catholic and Protestant. But with Protestant, it was often as founders of churches. Women are often less threatening.
Yeah, right.
And I believe he's often used women as the first voice because women are treated differently. And I think that that's the thing we forget. Like I was on a team. Why were women and men together on a team in our ministry? It's because if you're only listening to half of your audience, you're only meeting the needs of half of your audience. And if there's no voice for half of your audience, you are limiting what you can be hearing and what you can be doing in ministry. And also, if the hearing is just on 2 sides that never meet, you end up creating 2 churches.
Sure.
You end up creating the women's church and the man's church.
Okay.
Instead of one church. And that's not what you're wanting to do, but often ends up being what you do. I think that that's the best way to go in a church, is to hear everyone.
Generational and cultural shifts were the next topic to come up in the research. Key thing we learned from the research was that personal beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by cultures, by generations, and by changing expectations. So the report shows that women today are navigating very different realities than even a generation ago. More women are working, they're bringing their professional skills into the church life, but at the same time, they're often still carrying the same expectations at home and in the church. So what does participation look like when everything else is shifting? Here are a few stories that highlight that tension.
Well, I think I would have felt pressured, a lot more pressure, to bake cookies and be volunteering in the nursery and children's church. But within our church, we've always had women in leadership, and that's something that really drew me to the church. Just speaking generally, I think there would have been a lot more pressure to participate in those traditionally assumed women's roles. So I don't know if it's by nature that things have changed or it's just our church, but I never felt and don't feel pressured to volunteer in junior church or the hospitality, committee, but I was asked to be on our parish council. I think culturally things have changed. I think more women are working in careers and therefore our talents are more geared towards, administrative kind of board roles. I'm now working, so therefore my ability to actually contribute, I think, will go down significantly. I just think a lot more women are working a full-time job outside the home and then also taking care of everything that was previously expected of them to do. So I wonder if there's less women able to actually take on roles like the one that I've taken on, because it does take quite a bit of time in evenings.
Growing up in Chinese heritage churches, Letty explains how multicultural shifts and Asian culture values influence ways younger generations perceive leadership and service. Letty notes that while older women are deeply respected for their faithfulness, younger women seek roles that align with their personal gifts rather than traditional expectations of duty.
So I work with Ambassadors for Christ in Canada as the Director of Field Ministry. And so our work is primarily with the Chinese heritage churches and students from that space, from high school to university. There is an element of culture where there's hierarchy in Asian culture. There's the shame and honor space. When your child is successful, that gives you honor. And shame comes from if your child isn't functioning as the norm or societal expectation within the Canadian society. The added is when they can tell family back home, oh, we're succeeding in this new place that we're in. Yeah, finance is a big part of security. And so they want the child to succeed in school so that they can get good jobs.
In our interviews with women, we asked informants, what are one or two important influences on your life? And 4 people in our interviews had mentioned an older, theologically competent and faithful woman in a pastoral role of sorts at their church. So some of them were ordained, some were not, but they had this sort of official role. And then when I looked closely at who was being influenced by this kind of pastoral presence, 3 out of the 4 women were East Asian. And so do you think this is a coincidence, or do you think there's a cultural piece that could explain this?
I think partially there is a cultural piece in that in order to have an official role or whatnot, all those credentials need to come with it. It's seen as something that is honorable. In the churches with 3 languages, for example, and in order to have a voice, you need to work hard to earn that credibility so that you can have a seat at the table and be a voice for the next generation kind of thing.
Okay, interesting. So these women in our interviews who said, I really admire and am influenced by this particular woman who is typically older and in a position of influence. It's a reflection then of faithfulness over time to a degree?
To a certain degree. You would see that they have had invested so much into that space. And not only that, I think there's relational community is very important to Asian culture. And so it's a collectivist community. And so how you contribute continues to grow over time. And then the way you contribute builds relationships, and that relationships also builds you credibility in that way.
But there was a sense from some of the younger Asian informants that while they respected the older women in their congregation, they weren't always seen as role models. So there's this element of admiration, but not aspiration. And this was largely in terms of service. They were saying things like, I respect what they do, but I don't want to serve in the same way, or I'd like to serve in fewer ways. What are some of the generational dynamics that these responses might be touching on?
I think for that part, it's really interesting because I can think of very faithful women and people that I love and adore, but I wouldn't want to be in their shoes because so much of it sometimes comes from expectation or duty. For example, a lot of pastor wives. We joke about it sometimes, but it's not that funny. But at the same time, it's like when you hire a pastor in a Chinese setting, a lot of times there's like an expectation of what like his wife's role is to also be alongside. But this is an unpaid role. And it's like, the hours are just as long, if not longer. And like there's this like duty and expectation to serve very faithfully and quietly in the background.
Now, what do you see as some of the implications of maybe changing generational values for bicultural and multicultural churches?
There's just like an expectation that like all the girls would help in children ministry, but no one asked if you were good at it or even if you like kids. You know, it's like, oh, why wasn't I asked for AV, for example? And so those like gender roles kind of sometimes come into play.
Our third segment has to do with participation and gifting. As we move from cultural shifts into actual participation, one of the biggest questions the study raises is where and how are women participating in the life of the church? Women are deeply involved in church life, and the data makes that clear. But when you ask how they're valued as women, the answer gets a little more complicated. Many of the stories that we heard center around caregiving, hospitality, and relational work, roles that are essential, but they're not always visible or formally recognized. So in this section, we listen to stories about what participation really looks like on the ground and what it means to feel seen or unseen in these roles.
The motto of the church is to make the hope of Jesus known, whether that's in neighborhoods or in the nations. I first came to that church, then my husband, and there's certain things I didn't like. But now, looking back, one of the pastors preached when they accepted us as members to accept one another as Christ Jesus has accepted you, which is Romans 15. And that really hit me. I've learned to accept each one and love them. The first thing they said was, we're going to put them to work. And I've done just about everything you can do in the church except preaching. I've taught Bible studies and been Sunday school superintendent, done the music. And yeah, I do pastoral care now. I've done a lot of visiting people in their homes, praying with them, praying with the dying. I'm going to bring poinsettias now to shut-ins. And yeah, that's counseling. I've done marriage counseling.
Living on the East Coast, Albie advocates for Mandarin speakers in her church. She's often serving her church as the pianist or worship leader, as a preacher, or teaching children's Sunday school. She described her Sunday morning as going to church with a task.
What is stopping you from making this change, from stepping back?
There's a need. And then at a certain point, I was asking others to delegate through all different tasks. But people are not unwilling, but at this point, they do not have more capacity to take over those tasks. So I have to keep doing it. Because honestly with you, a couple of days ago, when we have the planning schedule for whoever the pianist or worship leaders to assign each role to person, so that make sure that we can have all our Sunday service schedule. So every Sunday, I'm either a pianist or a worship leader or taking care of the children's Sunday school. So every Sunday, I go to church with a task. I don't have a moment really to enjoy the sermon or enjoy the communion. But then we are also seeking for helpers. And most people come to the church to seek God's face, to hear the sermon.
Wow.
We just need more and more help to support on different positions. So I guess that's the challenges at this point.
How do you reconcile like your busyness at church and then adding education alongside your full-time job? How do you find capacity to do it all?
I find the education that I'm going to receive and then with the ministry, it just goes hand in hand. God always teaching me through the ministry and also help me to reflect on my study. So I don't really find that really consumes too much time of me, because what I experience in the ministry can be a part of my assignment for my study, because I really want to know God. I feel like what I've heard at church from different pastors or different preachers are not enough. I don't really trust online stuff. So that I thought, I need to get some knowledge from a theological school. I'm not going to initiate the change, but the study has completely changed my focus. Instead of looking for a result, I'm more focusing in the process at this moment. It is important for me to accompany the ministry, and eventually God will take me to make a change. So I'm not going to take on by myself.
When I was sick, I had cancer. Those women, they called, they cared, and they cooked. All 3 C's. Women stepped up there. So I've needed them in times for prayer and encouragement. There were men that, they would send a message or they would call, but I think men, when it comes to sickness or illness, they feel uncomfortable. I think that's a thing. I think men feel uncomfortable being uncomfortable. So when they feel uncomfortable, they just freeze. I think women are more willing to step out and step forward. That said, I married into a large family, so I have brother-in-laws, so I would hear from them. But, they're not going to send me cinnamon buns unless their wives say, hey, let's send some cinnamon buns. From a practical sense, I think women are wired to nurture. This is why, we need each other. We need men because we are wired differently. We balance each other. We're so, integral. I always joke, I'll go in the washroom stall and I'm like, a man designed this, because they weren't thinking about that we come in different sizes. When it comes to buying certain things, a woman-owned company that makes a product, there's certain things that you were like, yeah, she got it, because she thought about how we will use this product. We need men because they just give that other perspective. They give that balance to the way we look at things. But I will often say to my husband, if he was at a meeting and they were planning something, you know what? You might want to bounce that off a woman. It'd be really good to have a woman at the table. When I started seeing women on board leadership, I could see a more wholesome leadership, because when things were planned or set out, you could see that there was another side of the brain involved in planning the event. Let's just say planning a dinner. If you don't have a woman involved in the planning, these guys may forget the napkins, the forks. They're going to think about the location. They're going to think about the place. They're going to talk about what food they want. But women are going to say, okay, how are we going to cater for those who have allergies or food sensitivities? Can a wheelchair fit in the building? Are the tables spread apart so that, so-and-so who's in a wheelchair could get through?
Women told stories about having to navigate obstacles and hidden barriers. Even when women are participating in ways that are meaningful for them, there are often barriers that aren't immediately obvious. The report talks about these as hidden obstacles, things like limited access to mentorship, expectations that were different from men than for women, or simply not being given the same space to grow and practice. These aren't always explicit policies. Sometimes they're cultural norms, they're assumptions, or they're patterns that have just been there for generations. So in this section, we heard stories that focus on these barriers, especially the ones that are the hardest to name.
If women are growing up in a place where they don't see a lot of women in roles and sort of leadership roles, they don't see women living into leadership roles. It's hard for girls to imagine themselves there. I think that's a barrier. If women don't typically have roles of leadership or teaching or preaching in a church context, then the girls growing up in that environment won't necessarily be encouraged to follow those impulses in themselves if they have them.
Well, I'm there earlier. Church starts at 10:30 in the morning. I'm usually over at the building around 9 o'clock. There's some people that show up 5 minutes before church starts and they're kind of rushing and just getting in there and all in a whirlwind. Well, I've already been there an hour and a half. There's a responsibility to lead and be sensitive to the Holy Spirit too. Because, of course, you go with a plan and structure, but we don't want to be so structured that we quench the move of the Holy Spirit. So there's this responsibility of making sure that things aren't chaotic and out of order, but also there's space for Holy Spirit to move and the flow of things, and just opening up space for people to move in their giftings, because it's body ministry, and I'm very open to that. It's not just, I'm the pastor, so I run the whole thing. It's we're a body and every joint supplies. So I make space for that, and just making sure that everything moves and flows.
So I think it's something that has to be overcome by encouragement, or, somebody mentoring, or taking the time even just to say it out loud. Hey, we see this in you. And have you ever considered this or this or this? And so a barrier in my mind is access to sort of the training and education. I think access to practice, there's lots of situations in which young men typically in the past are given this pass to practice preaching. He's just learning. So we give them lots of grace and whatever. But there's this idea that if a woman is going to preach, if a woman is going to lead something like that, she's going to have to hit it out of the park. Otherwise, it's just not going to, I actually have that experience in being part of a leadership team where that comment has been made that, hey, we're fine to hire a female pastor, but, if we're looking for a male, he'll have to be at least a 7 out of 10. If it's going to be a female, she's going to have to be a 10 out of 10. That idea, that barrier of we don't get offered the opportunity to practice our craft. We just have to be good at it in order to be invited to use our gifts. And then I think there's probably some logistical barriers, which, things like pregnancy or maternity leave, whether or not concessions are made for that, like whether you have to sort of choose between the two, or whether it always feels like you're an inconvenience because you want to build a family alongside the roles that you play. I think that becomes a barrier for some. And those are just a few that come to mind.
A veteran pastor with 27 years of experience who currently serves as a senior associate pastor in a large multicultural church in BC, Marty details her spiritual and professional journey marked by gender-related obstacles. She talks about the unique challenges women face in ministry, institutional barriers, self-doubt, and the need for collaborative leadership. Throughout her conversation with Lindsay, she advocates that women's voices and diverse gifts are essential for a healthy, functioning church.
Did anything surprise you about entering into the world of faith?
My dad grew up Catholic, but he was kind of an independent thinker. He was an educator. He really valued women. He valued women's contribution. So I was surprised when I joined an evangelical church that there were questions around women and what women could do and what was a good woman. There were different models than I had grown up with. So that was something that I definitely had to think through, like, what gifts has God given me? What has God called me to? How am I going to use those gifts? What are the limitations and what are the opportunities?
Encountering that, what made you stay to work through it?
Probably I hit a crisis in my early 20s when I realized that there was a call into ministry and that the church might actually not be ready for the gifts I had. So a little Brethren church, they actually had hired a woman as a pastor. And so I saw a model of that, which was really lovely to see. Then I had my mentor who had been a missionary and now was working in Christian ministry. So I did see women outside maybe the model that was more popular in the early 80s at that point. So there were moments of feeling frustration and anger for sure. And in the ministry I worked for, there was a lot of mixed messages, like, you're a leader, but you can't do this. You're a leader, but you can't do this. And so it was really confusing. And so for me, that was a question. What do women have that they can bring to the table that maybe men haven't recognized? What can we contribute? And I think obviously, and this has been recognized in the last 30 or 40 years, that collaborative leadership has some real strengths, that women have learned how to collaborate because they haven't had positional power. And so I think, again, this is something women can bring to the church and to Christian leadership. Having seen over the years of ministry how much people bring to the table that I don't have, there is more of a sense of value what other people bring and recognize my own shortcomings. And so I really want to not just lead as a pastor where I'm doing everything, but I really want to develop teams and see those teams lead from their strengths and gifts.
The way that you're using the word leadership, you're not necessarily expecting them all to move into pastoral ministry. Right. So how do you understand kind of that empowerment and leadership? What does leadership look like in that context?
I would look at leader as someone who can influence other people, who has a vision of where to go and can bring people along with them. It is not a positional role. It's a leader who's a servant, a leader who aligns himself with the formal leadership and isn't against them, can be a very powerful person in a good way in a church.
Now, you mentioned this pastoral support group and they're all women. Could you tell me, why do you think it's important that you're all female pastors?
I share at a different level with women than I do with men, but there's something about women getting together that there's less barriers to sharing. And so again, it's just easy, I think. And then we all also experience challenges as women in ministry that men don't experience. And so those are some things that sometimes come up in our group, and we can support each other through that.
Okay. Are you comfortable sharing what some of those challenges might be?
Yeah. Well, for instance, I'll share one. A new Christian in our church came up to me and he said, "Hey, what's this about women in ministry? You were up one day praying and a guy beside me said, 'Hey, what do you think that woman up there is praying and she's a pastor?'" It's like, I didn't know there were any issues about that. And so again, that constant, not by everyone, but by certain people sort of doubting and undermining your call or your role, like, who are you to do this? That's something that women experience. Again, not from everyone, but certainly that happens. It happens not infrequently. Another time, a man came up to my husband and said, "Why do you allow your wife to preach?" And, again, he had to respond to that, undermining. Sometimes those issues come up. There's research that in leadership, people tend to look for people who look like them, who lead like them. And so because women don't tend to be the ones hiring or promoting, that there might be this sense of, you don't look like what I think this position should have. And so that's another experience women have. And then I think women just experience a lot of self-doubt. And so again, that sense of self-doubt is part of what it means to be a woman in our culture, at least.
Getting to kind of understanding the roles of women, I'd love to understand how you understand the roles of women in the church.
Yeah. I start by looking at the story of creation, of God creating male and female, saying that they're in his image and giving them the dominion mandate and the creation mandate together. I look at Genesis 2, where it wasn't good for Adam to be alone. And so God found a helper fit for him. And this word helper, as we know, is a word primarily used for God in the Old Testament as a rescuer. And this rescuer didn't come from above or from below, but from his side, to be a partner with him, to care for the creation and to love each other. And so I think the creation story is just a wonderful story of men and women working together. The fall demonstrates what happens when we stray from God's plan, which then I would see that as a place where women experienced diminution. I don't know how you want to say that. They were diminished in their position and have since experienced misogyny and devaluation. And that's a result of the fall, not as a result of creation. And that Christ came, he had women disciples along with men disciples. They weren't the 12, but they traveled with him. They financially supported him. Women, were at the last at the cross and the first at the resurrection. They were part of the church at Pentecost that were given the gift of the Holy Spirit. Began to preach and prophesy. In Romans 16, you can see all the amazing women that worked alongside Paul in sharing the gospel. And so again, throughout church history, women have always been at the forefront of movements of the Spirit. And that as the church has gotten more top down, women have lost those positions. And so I kind of see that diminishing women is not God's design, but God desires to give his gifts to his people, that we need all people to lead and to serve together, and that men and women are at their best when they work together and they contribute their uniqueness and their gifting. And if we can partner together, instead of looking at the church as a place of power and authority, but a place of love and service, I think the arguments around why women couldn't lead and serve really are diminished.
Our church is really good at having Bible studies and groups and gatherings. Being a single mom, I'm only ever surrounded by women. That's it. And so I actually value more mixed groups to actually hear from the male perspective. It's so much different than female ones. Like, I have my Sunday morning, I hear a pastor preach, but other than that, I don't hear from a male mind, like, ever. I'm a single parent. So everyone just thinks that single people are out looking for their husband, not actually just wanting to glean more in a mixed group. So my best friend is also single, and it's kind of the same for her too. It's just a weird spot, being when you're in your 30s and a single person.
The final segment theme is disillusionment and staying power. This is one of the most important and complex questions in the study. Why do women stay and why do they leave? Because the stories aren't one-dimensional, some women step away out of frustration or just exhaustion. Others remain deeply committed, even through difficulties, because of their strong sense of calling, their community, or their hope for change. And also interesting how women are finding meaningful spaces outside the traditional church, whether in academic, parachurch work, or other communities related to their faith. So in this final section, we're holding these tensions together, disillusionment on one hand and deep resilience on the other, hoping that the balance shines through in these women's stories.
At one point, the pastor's wife at the church that I was at for a long time reached out to me, which I really appreciated. And she said, "I want to start a women's Bible study. I want it to be different. Would you like to be part of discussing and planning with me?" And I said, absolutely. I would totally love to. And so we met a few times and I talked about things like, I'm a professional woman. I'm a single mom with 3 kids. Please, you can't expect me to attend a Bible study at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and do crafts. It's never going to happen. I don't know. I said, I don't think we need to gather around a fill-in-the-blank Bible study guide and repeat after me answers. I think we actually need to be vulnerable with each other and talk and get to know each other and create a safe space where we can be honest and discuss our faith and our families, where we can actually support each other as women and as Christian women. And in the end, after we'd met a couple of times, she scheduled it and said, "Well, I'm going to use this book by whoever, and it has a Bible study guide with fill-in-the-blank answers, and that's what we're going to do." And I looked at her and said, "What do you want me to do?" "I just want you to come." Okay, so I came to the first one. She split us up into groups, and they started, doing sanctification is the answer that we all write down here. And I said in my group, I'm sorry, I'm really struggling with this. I don't want to hear what you think the fill in the answer blank is. I would rather we talk about what's on your heart, what's holding you back today, what are you struggling with? Because, this is what I'm struggling with. What's going on for you? And suddenly this group of women melted. They were open and sharing. One woman said, "This is so much better. This is what I want." I said, "Yeah, this is what I'd like too." I said, "Well, if this is what you'd like, talk to the leader because, she's chosen to go a different way. And I want to respect what she's doing. Maybe not everybody wants this." And then that was the end of it. I just never went back. I just couldn't do it again.
Outside the church, I've appreciated being valued. Like a couple of years ago, I went to an academic setting, but what I found amazing, it was the first time in my life I felt like I could talk with other scholars and they wouldn't care that I was a woman. We were having just good theological conversations, just being there and talking about God or about the Bible or about each other's studies, that it wasn't the contribution of a woman. It was just my contribution as a person, as a believer, as someone who loves the Bible. And maybe it's because I've been raised in a very traditional environment and I'm still in a very traditional one. Being able to question how we do things traditionally, always looking at the Bible for those answers. And I feel like I make people uncomfortable when I do that. I feel like I should be a yes woman, always agreeing, always repeating what other people are saying, but I don't always agree with what they're saying, and I don't want to just repeat what I don't believe in. I don't feel comfortable with that. I've tried. I've tried to take leadership courses for women. Every time we had a meeting, I was basically told that we were not supposed to be talking about the Bible because our husbands were supposed to do that. So women were trained to talk about other subjects related to the Bible, but without looking directly at the Bible. So That's how women leaders were trained at, my other churches.
I'm a member of a Baptist church. I've been there since 1966. I had various leadership roles in the church, and I love the church with all my heart. The church has changed a lot. It's everything I've prayed it would be from the beginning of the time I was there. It hasn't been a straightforward path. It's been up and down. But gradually, I think we've come to a tremendous form of Christian identity and worship and outreach.
Nikki offers the perspective as a single woman who wants to contribute to church governance with her professional skills. In her conversation with Lindsay, Nikki also talks about what it's like to be single in a church full of families, how information is siloed, and how expectations are different.
I have been born and raised in the church, and that's been a really big part of my DNA as a person. I didn't come to faith myself until I was 19. Despite knowing all the answers, I had to figure it out for myself and not just believe blindly. So that has made it very real for me. I mean, I'm single, so I do think that impacts me. In fact, I was having this conversation with my pastor and his wife, and I was just saying to them, I've been in situations where I've had leadership say, okay, well, the ladies stay here, and us as men, we're going to go over here and we're going to have a conversation that only men are allowed to be involved in. The thing that I struggled with that is that I don't have a husband. So that conversation that you're having in private, I get nothing out of that. Like, I get no feedback, I get no information. And when you're serving in various capacities, if somebody is not coming back to you to say, here are the ways that we could improve, here are the things that we thought went well, and here's this story of this person who got saved, or we were praying for this person specifically who was diagnosed with a heart condition or whatever it is, I, as a single woman, was never privy to that information, am never privy to that information. And I think that is like just a small example of what has been my lived experience. Also, as a woman, the conversation of why in the church is the elders board and the requirement of the CRA, which is to have a board of directors, why are they the same thing? Why are they one board when I, as a woman, may have skills and gifts and talents and abilities that could be a really great advantage to the board of directors. And I'm personally am all for elders being men and shepherds and teachers and doing the work of elder as described in scripture.
Would you tell me about one or two ways that you think you participate differently in the local church today that a woman in your shoes would have a generation before you?
My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so she was back and forth to the church throughout the week. She was running the pioneer clubs for the church. Her and her sister, my aunt, were running our VBS. They were doing all kinds of things. And because they were stay-at-home moms, they had the capacity to do those things for the local church. I think that was fairly normal. That was a fairly normal existence for many of my peers who also grew up in the church, that their moms were just really involved. There were very few of my friends growing up whose moms worked outside of the home. And so I think that has really probably drastically been one of the biggest shifts and changes in the church and women working in and with and for the church in a volunteer capacity. Interestingly, though, like all of these roles had to do with children, had to do with ministries that related to children. So it could have been that, it wasn't frontline children's ministry, but it was like the planning for the Pioneer Girls Retreat, or it was the Vacation Bible School and who's going to be the band this year and getting them prepped or whatever the thing was. But that's what they were doing. And we don't do that anymore. I think it has just shifted so drastically as the world has shifted, as the economy has shifted, as women's rights in the workplace have become more of a thing that has really impacted the church.
For good or for ill?
I think it depends on how you look at it. I think for good. I think that they are necessary changes. There's a statue in Ottawa, and the woman's standing there, and she's got this big book that's open, and I don't even know who it is, but I have a picture beside it because it says, "Women are persons too." And I have a picture beside it, and every International Women's Day, I go back to that picture, and I think, yes, that's right. We are persons too. And I think it is important that there is value placed on the lives of women and understanding that we are equal but different.
Mm-hmm. What about the generation after you?
I will not be surprised if it swings back.
Okay, interesting.
One of my nephews, he's 16, and he was messaging me earlier today talking about how terrible AI is and how it's going to create a generation of people who don't know anything. And I was like, great, well, you need to go do some research on ethical use of AI, and you need to be the person that educates your peers and your friends on this. And so I think that there, particularly in the church, I think that there's going to be a swing of people who see what is the ethical dilemmas of society and how do we right them? And I think that if kids who are 16 are asking these questions now, they're going to start thinking, how do we act in such a way that honors God? And that's exactly the question my nephew's asking. I don't think it can go back in terms of gender roles. And I think that the world is too far from that at this point. But I can see it shifting in the sense of like how people are involved in church, and specifically women, like in terms of young children and having midweek programming. I don't know if that's clear at all, but I do think that I think there is going to be a shift again back to traditional values, but not necessarily in gender roles.
I always remember hearing sermons, people saying like, the harvest is plenty and the workers are few. And I'd be like, am I one of the workers? Am I allowed to? I wasn't sure if I was considered one of the workers because I wasn't male. So I could see that being like, that's not my call. So therefore, I don't do anything.
Women need to step up. Women need to be less afraid of stepping out of line. And I think that would be what I would want to say to women is don't be afraid to be curious. Don't be afraid and try to get involved in different ways, because I think that there is opportunity, and it's sometimes just a matter of figuring out how to plug you into it.
I have a positive outlook. I'm not a person that sees the glass half empty. I always see the glass half full. And I'm not given to depression or that sort of thing that really drags me down. I just have always had a very positive outlook on life. And I think that's helped because where other people have gotten discouraged, I sometimes wondered what there was to be discouraged about. And I must say that's a gift from the Lord. When we had a little difficulty a few years ago and people thought, well, what's the point of carrying on? What came to me was, this is an opportunity to make things better and do things differently. When our attendance got to be quite low and people were feeling like everybody's given up on us, I didn't feel that way. I just felt God had placed us there. He put this church in this neighborhood. He's provided for us in the past. Why shouldn't he do it again? It's a gift, I think, God has given me.
These are just a handful of stories. The number of stories, they're innumerable. And given the number of women and experiences, all we can do is just scratch the surface. And we know and hope that there are women who have stories that they want to tell, or who have heard these stories told and they are resonating with them. But we're at a time in the 21st century when things have taken a distinctive turn. Maybe it's the unearthing of evidence that helps us recognize the evil that has always existed. I'm really thinking about the revelations of abuse globally. But there's also been some stories of abuse in the evangelical church in Canada in the past couple of years. All of these new stories, these emerging stories, have had a major impact on the way women see their involvement. It's opening up a new layer of vulnerability. But I also think that these new stories are going to reshape the next generation. How is this going to change the way women participate in church?
Well, we did see an emphasis on the necessity for safety emerging from our interviews. That was definitely a theme. And it wasn't just a protection from physical harm, but it included feeling heard and valued and being able to ask hard questions without being ostracized from a community. And so we do see this value and this demand for safer environments within the church if women are to feel like they can participate. And abuse plays a big part of that, wanting to make sure that churches are striving to implement policies that protect women and other vulnerable people. Now, my hesitancies with addressing this topic is I don't have a lot of expertise. I'm not necessarily trauma informed when it comes to addressing topics of abuse. We did encounter women who had suffered and survived domestic violence in our interviews. And while it wasn't perpetrated by the church, some of it was exacerbated by the church's failure to recognize and respond to the signs of domestic violence. And so we definitely saw an area for great growth and potential that the church can respond to from our findings. And so what we do, at least in the report, is we try to outsource to the experts, because there are people who are studying this and know how to respond and know how to equip churches. And so I can point to the problem and say, please go to these people. But I do think that we're going to have to reckon with this. And there's also a generational part that came out was different tolerances for what is considered abuse or even toxic, if we want to kind of maybe bring it down a layer. For example, some of the older generations, while they disparaged gossip, and it was also kind of seen as something that they expected. And then I had a younger woman just say she wanted nothing to do with a gossiping community. And so she would pull away or not be part of those communities. So we could see with this emerging idea of what safety is beyond physical protection, and also to include like a safe environment in terms of emotionally, relationally, that we might see young people pulling away if they feel unsafe. So we're seeing changes from our small sample, and I think churches are going to have to reckon with becoming safer environments for women and other vulnerable groups.
This isn't a flippant conversation about trying to create safe spaces. This is just about common decency. This is about respecting other human beings. This isn't just about physical or sexual violence or abuse. This is about spiritual manipulation, psychological manipulation. This is about getting over your own ego and doing what Christ taught us to do, taught us to love other people unconditionally. This means sometimes having to sacrifice your own interests. Mm-hmm. From my observation of women and men who have left the church because they haven't got the kind of support or recognition in the way they've been treated, and the perpetrators haven't been called into account. Mm-hmm. Until we stop protecting the church as an institution and start protecting people as human beings, this problem is not going to end.
Right. It will persist if we don't address it, for sure.
This is an important area of story that requires another layer of sensitivity. It's not the goal of the research, but it seems to be a point of identification.
That's right. And we can link to some resources in the show notes.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Episode 4 is going to be about an event on January 31st, 2026, where the partners are coming together to discuss the final research. What are you anticipating, Lindsay, as you prepare for this event?
I'm anticipating a lot of feedback, but also I think a time to celebrate. We've been working on this for over 2 years. We've all been really invested in the research from day one. And so the partners have walked alongside the research process with me, and they've helped me sift through the findings and help steer the direction of the research and the production of a final report that would be ultimately helpful and useful for ministry workers on the ground. And so I think alongside getting feedback for this final report to make it the best document possible, it's also going to be a time of celebration and prayer. I hope that we'll just pray over what the report will ultimately accomplish, and hopefully that it will meet some important needs and contribute to the landscape of research on the Canadian church.
So in episode 4, there's going to be a variety of voices that are brought together, partners who have been involved in this research from the beginning, and we'll hear their reflections and hear your final reflections.
Outlooks, Pulpits, and Everything in Between is a project from the Women in the Canadian Evangelical Church Research Partnership. The show was produced by Toolkit Media and Education. Reenacted readings by Rebecca Fisher, Nancy Wing, and Lori Busatil. Music and mixing by Roy Salmon, sound design by Murray Stiller. Information about the study and the report on the National Study on Women in Canadian Evangelical Churches can be found at theefc.ca/women-in-church. Partners who collaborated on this research are Alberta and Northwest Territories District of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, Association d'Églises Baptistes Évangéliques au Québec, Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada, Fellowship Pacific, Gather Women, Impactus, Northwest Seminary, Small Church Connections, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, Tyndale University, Union d'Églises Baptistes Francophones au Canada, Vineyard, Vision Ministries Canada, Youth for Christ Canada.